everyone has fear, right? Anxiety and fear are there to protect us. Where they become concerning is if you are essentially non-functional. You can't go to school. You can't go to social situations. You can't be around dogs at all. Just an example of like a phobia, right? Like, it's what matters is, are you functional? Because it is very typical to experience anxiety before giving a presentation in front of your classmates. It's
Mhm.
not typical to have so much anxiety and fear that you're like throwing up or you can't
Mhm.
speak or you're shaking so hard or you're like completely avoiding school and faking sick that day because you have a presentation.
Mhm.
So it's just this idea of knowing your child enough to recognize like, okay, maybe we do need some professional help here because my child is not functional in
Mhm.
these different settings. And then collaborating with the therapist in order to, like I said, build a hierarchy of addressing these anxiety provoking situations. Because then you also have a partner who is supporting you through that.
Welcome to Soul Snacks, everybody. Super excited for this episode today. We brought in a very special guest today. And it's going to be a great episode because any of you out there listening who's a parent with children, I think you're going to get a lot of information from this episode that might be super helpful for you. So, courage doesn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like a child saying, I'm scared. Sometimes it looks like a parent saying, I don't know what to do. Dr. Julia Hilbert is a licensed psychologist who works with children and adolescents at Thriving Minds in Ada, Michigan, supporting youth navigating anxiety, OCD, depression, trauma, and big emotions that they don't have words for. In this conversation, we talk about what emotional courage actually looks like in children, how adults can support anxious kids without unintentionally reinforcing fear, and why regulation, not perfection, is the foundation of mental health. This episode is for parents, caregivers, educators, and anyone who wants to better understand the inner world of children and themselves. So let's dive in. How are you today, Julia?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here with the both of you.
Well, we're really excited to have you. And I just gave, a little background about what this episode's going to be today,
Mhm.
but we kind of want to hear from you. So who is Dr. Julia Hilbert?
Well, like you said, I'm a child and adolescent psychologist. I have been, working with kids for a number of years at this point. And I just really enjoy the work that I do. I get to do a lot of work with parents and families as well as the direct work that I do with kids, which I feel like ties in really nicely with my work, which you'll hear today on the podcast. And then just generally as a person, I have a life outside of work too. And I really just enjoy being active, exploring the Grand Rapids community, spending time with friends and family too.
Awesome. And I will say that Julia is a Michigan State grad. Go
I
Michigan
am, I
State.
am, go green.
And she also happens to be my niece. So I'm really very excited to have her here today.
And also
So,
go blue. No, I was just kidding.
boo, boo.
I had to represent a little
I have
bit.
to
Come on.
really say boo to that because not only did I go to Michigan State for my undergrad, I went to another Big Ten school for my doctorate. So I went to the University of Wisconsin for that. So,
Okay.
really not into the blue.
Well, to be
No.
fair, we're recording during March Madness, and I'm pretty sure that Michigan and Michigan State they're still in it right now. So
Yes.
we're going Big Ten, right? We're all
That's
gonna
right.
just suck it up and
Yeah.
go Big Ten right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Big Ten's having a good start to the tournament this year, which is exciting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to just go ahead and dive in, Julia, because we have lots of questions for you today. And we're really excited to hear some of the things that you're going to tell us. But I guess I want to start with saying, you spend your days sitting with children in their most vulnerable moments. What's something kids today are carrying that adults often underestimate?
Really, the awareness of everything going on in the world around them. I think there is obviously a lot happening within society, within the government, with health that is impacting adults in a way, but I think sometimes adults don't quite realize like how aware children are of everything going on in the world. I always tell people the two biggest impacts that I just continue to see on kids, no matter their age, are like one, social media, just generally how that exists in our society and how, us as adults like never had to experience that growing up. And then two, the way that like social isolation from COVID has just impacted kids again from 5 to 18. I still see these effects come through.
Wow, that's super interesting. I guess I didn't really factor in. It seems like COVID was so long ago. I guess
Yeah.
I know that it's definitely had some effect on people, but I guess that's not the first thing that I would have thought of. You know, worldly issues, the way that people are processing those, the way that kids are seeing their parents processing those. I think those are all like things that I would automatically think of off the top of my head. But the COVID thing, I guess that one just kind of that's surprising to me. So
Yeah.
yeah. So what do you think that like what emotions do you see the most? Like so and which ones tend to scare adults the most, do you think?
I would say, of course, I see a lot of kids coming and presenting with anxiety, fear. As you mentioned, I work with kids who have OCD, ADHD, a variety of presentations. But I would say the emotions that tend to scare the adults in kids' lives are anger, aggression, irritability, but it's so important to be aware of how like things like anxiety and depression often present as anger and irritability and aggression in children. And so I think adults sometimes are scared or unsure of how to handle those types of emotions in these tiny humans that they see every day, and that often can come in presenting as I have no idea how to handle this behavior. But then when you actually get to the root of that, you're realizing it's something, more significant like anxiety or depression.
That's so interesting.
Well, and it may in when you think like children's brains aren't they don't have the rational side of
Hmm.
things, right? Where like when adults with anxiety and depression or whatever, you start to think about it. You start to like, okay, what does this look like? What does it mean? Where am I being impacted by it? All of that logical thought process that goes through it where children haven't developed that yet, right? And so the emotion, whatever the spectrum might be, anger, frustration, it's like that's their communication style in a way, right?
Yeah,
Would that be fair to say?
absolutely. And part
Yeah.
of it is like kids just don't understand the feeling that they are feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is where they can benefit from coming into something like individual therapy, is just like even in the first place, learning to identify what is even going on in my body and in my brain right
Mhm.
now, right? Like I'm
Mhm.
presenting as frustrated or I'm blowing up about something, but in reality, it's because I'm scared or I'm
Mhm.
anxious or I'm worried.
Mhm. Do you feel sorry, I'm going rogue here.
Oh, you're
Do you
fine.
feel like in general, there is more attention put on children's therapy? I mean, because like when I think of the pandemic, that makes absolute sense to me. And maybe it's because in I have young nieces and nephews. My stepdaughter is 18.
Mm.
So during the time of the pandemic, it was middle school, high school, really significant points in their developmental life where all of a sudden they're remote school or like I had young nieces and nephews where everybody had masks on. So they
Mm.
weren't even able to figure out the expression that people had when they were talking, these things that we take for granted now. Do you think that in general, there's been a rise in parents seeking therapy for their children these days?
I would say, yeah. I think, generally speaking, we see, I think there's a lot of discussion around the rise of one, children in therapy, two, diagnostic rates of certain conditions.
Mhm.
But it all stems from the fact that there's just more awareness these days of, what these different presentations mean, right? Rather than maybe traditionally in the past, like, oh my gosh, my kid is irritable and non-compliant and angry. It's like, they just don't want to listen to me. Instead, it becomes like, I want to understand a little bit more about what's going on. And part of that comes around, I think, general conversations in society
Mhm.
that have allowed conversations around like therapy and mental health to be more open and more normalized. And so I do think that helps a lot. And it helps with kids who, they have friends in school who also go to therapy. Now, I'm not saying there isn't still a stigma around it, but I would say generally like, yes, rates are rising, but it's because of, I think, broader conversations that are happening
Yeah,
within our society.
that makes sense.
Well, and it's funny, Becca and I on some of our episodes have talked before about like the difference between like the baby boomers and the Gen Xers and then this generation now and how when as Gen Xers, like we were just kind of told to stuff our feelings down and to pull up your bootstraps and get to work. And, there was no time for feelings and you just dealt with stuff, right? Well, you didn't really deal with stuff, but you dealt with, you did what you could
Yeah.
do. And there was a huge stigma around therapy. And I have come to learn, over the years how awesome therapy can be for
Mhm.
people. And I love that society is changing and becoming more accepting of
Mhm.
um making sure that people are seeking help if they need it. And it is something that I feel is out there so much more than it ever was
Yeah.
before.
Well, to your point, Cami, like we were all told to, just deal with it. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Like I know there are plenty of people, our age who had therapy growing up and whatnot, but maybe we're like we're trying to course correct instead of, like
Yeah.
we're all in therapy and then we're also like, oh, children should also be in therapy so we can get ahead of it instead of having a bunch of adults who are
And I'll say, like, that isn't to say I don't encounter parents who maybe pathologize things that are going
Mm,
on with their kids and
mhm,
want kids whose root challenges are maybe rooted in like parenting practices or neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD or ASD that can't be cured,
mhm.
to just like be in therapy constantly as if that's going to like make everything better, when in reality a lot of it is around environmental supports that parents can provide, which is why I do so much parent work too. And I
Oh,
will say something
interesting.
I really like about the work that I do, the practice that I'm in, as well as just generally my experience with child and adolescent therapy, is it is so goal focused, right? The goal is not to be in therapy forever. And it's not to say there aren't, I would say, older teens who maybe engage more in what you would consider like traditional talk therapy, just like adults tend to do a bit more. But I'll say it's more goal focused, skill based, and the goal is like, 6 months to a year max. Great, you're out and you're functioning, and you learned a lot of skills that can support you in all of these challenging areas of your life, but you're not in therapy forever.
Hmm.
So how does it work with you and your clients? So do you often have sessions with the clients and the kids, or the kids first and then the parent? Or I think I said the clients and the kids. I meant the parents and the
Yeah.
kids together, so that they can kind of come together. And how does that work? I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends. Where I work, we do have parent specific programs as well, where like sometimes I never even see the kid, even though the kid is technically considered the client. We have something called parent problem solving program. We also have ADHD focused program, sleep based program, along with some others that really we're just working with the parents. And that is to give them behavioral strategies that they can implement at home to help with various behaviors that are going on that really rely on the parent implementing strategies with consistency in order to support these behavior changes, right? It's not a kid who's anxious learning how to identify those feelings and manage them. Instead, it's like, I'm, struggling with sleep or maybe struggling with following through on chores or different routines. And I need my parent to implement these different strategies that I can use. So that's
Mhm.
kind of one bucket, is like really just parent focused work. And then within the individual therapy space, we're constantly collaborating with parents too. That traditionally looks like, check-ins at the beginning or end of sessions. We're like, hey, this is what we worked on. This is how you can practice it at home. So you're actually getting out practice in the real world, right? Like, I'm only seeing this kid for an hour a week. I don't expect that to suddenly result in a change if we're not actually practicing these skills out in the real world. And occasional parent sessions sprinkled throughout where it's just me typically meeting with the parents and again, giving more specific strategies for challenges they're having at home or addressing specific issues. Um, And in particular, certain treatments, like particularly something like exposure therapy that you would use for like phobia, for OCD, really needs a lot of parent collaboration and support. And so we're kind of constantly meeting around that too. So it really can differ, vary and differ, but we're not doing something like family therapy where it's like the parent and the child in the room working through like a specific issue between them necessarily. That would be somebody who is like trained in specific, family therapy, which is a whole other ball game, honestly.
Oh,
Than
oh, okay.
individual client work and parent work that's really just designed to support the child.
Okay.
Is there any part of that because like independence for like figuring out independence for kids is so important during these young ages to where like them really being able to do things on their own and have their goals and whatnot, obviously with the support of parents, but for like, is that any part of it when you think about like the development of children for that independent focus?
Absolutely. And I think, oftentimes when kids are struggling, we see parents naturally accommodate them more. Either doing certain tasks for them, assisting in avoidance of certain triggers or anxiety provoking situations. And so part of this is also teaching parents when to kind of essentially back off and support their kids, but also help in that development of independence, whether it is in managing anxiety and fearful situations or in skills that they can and should learn. And when you're looking at this different ballgame, you're often scaffolding it. So you're starting off with more support and slowly pulling back the support. So it's not all of a sudden I'm fully expecting you to do this on your own without any teaching or support that I can offer you. And so we help parents do that too. But the goal is absolutely to really build independence in a lot of those areas.
Okay.
I think that I'm going to go on a little bit of a
Yeah.
tangent here because what something that you said reminds me of things that I did when my son was growing up. And now of course being so much older and having hindsight perspective,
Of course.
I know there were a lot of times where I overcompensated and stepped in because he wasn't necessarily behaving in the manner that I was hoping that he would.
Uh,
Um, but, a lot of that was because I felt like there was an insecurity on my part of like, are people going to think I'm a bad mom? And if my kid is this loser in class, in my head, these are all the stories I'm telling myself. He's not paying attention. He's not doing this. He's not doing that. So I would try to step in and do these things for him when in hindsight, I think, gosh, what was I doing? What was I thinking? And I think it's really important, like the message here being that, like, if you are one of the listeners here and you find yourself in that situation, how important it is for you to potentially get into therapy and try to figure out why those types of things are coming out. Because I think when you get to the root of the cause of what's making you do things, you don't necessarily, you're even having any kind of impact on your kid until later.
mhm. And, you would not be the first parent who I've talked to that says like, you obviously want your child to succeed and be happy and healthy. And there's a way that you can help build independence and build skills and allow them to kind of essentially safely fail so that they can build this independence and these skills and really learn how to do things on their own. That is, again, still safe, doesn't have this like lasting negative impact. But of course, the first time you're parenting is the first time you're parenting.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And we're not going to solve the world problems today, but I feel like we're going to go down some really good rabbit holes. And I know that this is probably even like a really broad question, but what do you think the difference is between enabling kids in situations, especially when there is, like anxiety, depression, like these are serious things, you know what I mean? And there are very real statistics about the harm that they cause children and
Absolutely.
adolescents. And like there is a, you want to support, right?
Mhm.
But to what point, right? At what point is it, hey, there has to be something else that is done. So what do you think is the difference between enabling in situations versus supporting? And if you have just like some general examples of what that might look like, that's great. But if not, even just kind of the concept of what you think those differences are.
Absolutely. So I used this term earlier, right? Like the idea of accommodations. And that's often how we tend to phrase it is like parents are implementing these accommodations in order to make their child's life easier, to make their lives easier, right? Like sometimes it's just not worth it to take the time to gently push your child to try and something that is like really difficult for them, right? You're like, I've got a million things to do. And so the reason why we call it accommodations is just this idea is like you are obviously accommodating things to make everybody's life a little bit easier. But essentially, how you can look at it is like, is my child safe? Are they going to be fine? Yeah. Are they maybe going to feel something like anxiety? Yes. But are they safe? Also, yes. Okay, great. Let's push them. Let's not enable them to avoid certain situations. I think a perfect example of this can be something like social anxiety, something like a specific phobia. Now, there's absolutely ways to scaffold things. So there's this term that we like to use, particularly in OCD related treatment, but I think you can also just generally use it when you're looking at something like fear or anxiety that's called flooding, which is essentially where you put the child in like the single most anxiety provoking situation to them. Like, bye, have fun, good luck, and just expect it to go well. In treatment, we build something called a hierarchy where you start with like kind of the least anxiety provoking situations and build them up to be able to engage in the most anxiety provoking situations. So again, there's a very safe way to do this, but as part of that, it will involve pushing your kid to do things that make them feel anxiety. And so if you let them avoid those situations, you are enabling them. You're just reinforcing the anxiety and the fear because you're saying, you feel anxiety, you avoid this situation, anxiety goes away. And that just reinforces it for them instead of, yes, you feel anxiety, but you are fine. You can handle it. Here are these skills to help you handle it. Go out and do this anxiety provoking situation. So I know it's kind of a long ramble, but essentially it's just the idea of like, is your child safe? Because I was actually just listening to another podcast the other day with Brene Brown and Adam Grant. They just started one. And something Brene Brown was saying kind of spoke to me and reminded me of some of the conversations we were preparing for this podcast, which is essentially is like there's a difference between trauma and adversity, right? So like let your kids try things and fail and don't protect them from everything because they're never going to learn. And the anxiety and avoidance will be reinforced. As long as you know they're safe, push them. Adversity is okay because it helps people grow. So there is this significant difference. Like if you, again, were just to, I mean, a perfect example is, the age old, oh, just throw your kid in the pool and they'll figure out how to swim, right? Like you've never taught them any skills. You throw them in a pool and you walk away. Like that is not being safe, right?
Yeah.
But, building up those skills in them and then maybe they have the skills, but they're too afraid to kind of get in, like help assisting them to getting into the water is an entirely different situation. And I know
That's a great, no, it's wonderful. And it's a great analogy, right? It's like you can give them the arm floats, like give them the little float, give them the lessons, whatever. And then at some point they're still having to get in and now put it into action and do the thing, right? No, I don't think that was a ramble at all. I think that's because there comes a point where it's like, yeah, if they're safe, like that it seems like an obvious indicator, right? But like making sure they're safe, and then it's okay to push a little bit. It it makes me wonder, how do you know how to keep, like, how hard do you push if there's, or how do I want to say this? Like, at what point does pushing start to concern that like you might break them, especially if there's anxiety, depression, or any other sort of real mental health issue?
And that is where I often also talk with parents, like, your child best, right? Like, when you are in that situation, this is not good, right?
Mhm.
Like they are absolutely losing their mind. Like this is not going to go over well. I can't, this is not the right method of doing things. And that is too where there's like a difference between, and I maybe touched on this a little bit or haven't yet, but anxiety is a normal part of life, right? Like everyone has anxiety.
Mhm.
Everyone has fear, right? Anxiety and fear are there to protect us. Where they become concerning is if you are essentially like non-functional. You can't go to school. You can't go to social situations. You can't be around dogs at all. Just an example of like a phobia, right? Like it's what matters is, are you functional? Because it is very typical to experience anxiety before giving a presentation in front of your classmates. It's
Mhm.
not typical to have so much anxiety and fear that you're like throwing up or you can't speak or you're shaking so hard or you're like completely avoiding school and faking sick that day because you have a presentation.
Mhm.
So it's just this idea of two, of knowing your child enough to recognize like, okay, maybe we do need some professional help here because my child is not functional in these different settings. And then collaborating with the therapist in order to like I said, build a hierarchy of addressing these anxiety provoking situations, because then you also have a partner who is supporting you through that, knows your child too, knows the skills that the child has and the types of situations they're able to handle. And so then when you go out and practice in the real world, again, you're not just saying like, okay, go out and do the most scary thing. It's this week we're practicing this specific situation.
Mhm.
And so if you have a kid who is overall functional but maybe feels some anxiety, you obviously can push them a little bit more. Now, I'll also say like we tend to also tie in things like reward systems with hierarchies or exposure activities, because sometimes you need that extrinsic motivation in order to override that fear part of your brain, right? Sometimes we use something called brave bucks, where kids can essentially like parents can reward kids for doing brave things by giving them brave bucks. And then they can exchange those brave bucks for rewards or prizes that they're like wanting to get. And that can be such a great reinforcer and motivator for kids to just try something, right?
Mhm.
Rather than just be like, okay, just go out and try it. It's okay. I'm going to give you 5 brave bucks if you can, you know, go up and introduce yourself to this kid at the
Mhm.
park. And so they have this extra motivator to do it. So sometimes you do have to have these other systems in place. But that is, again, I think it starts at, what is being impacted functionally, if anything, from this anxiety? Because again, anxiety is a very normal part of life.
Mhm. Mm.
Hmm.
It's like the Book It program. Like
Yeah.
I don't know if I was like, I don't know if you'd remember that, but it's like read books, get a pizza.
Yes.
You're like,
Yes.
okay,
Mhm.
do the
Yep.
thing.
Sometimes you need, hey,
Yeah.
sometimes you need that outside motivator.
Yeah.
And in order to override that part of your brain that's saying like, this is really scary and I don't want to do it.
Mhm. Even as adults.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes,
it's like,
totally.
that is, I don't care if
I
you're
do
a
it. I
child or an
reward
adult.
myself for doing hard things.
I know. That's exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah. Lord knows, like it's like, oh, if I go to the gym 5 days this week, that means I can have a pizza on Friday.
Yeah.
Sweet. I'm there.
It's like gardening season. So I'm like, oh, I get a new plant. Okay. More seed packets? Guess so.
Exactly.
Ah.
But I
So
think that, oh, sorry, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Kimmy.
No, go for
Mhm.
it.
Well, I was just going to say like I like personally, I still hate to see stigma around
Mhm.
any sort of therapy, right? No matter what the age is or what the circumstances. Because like the way you just explained things and the processes and the approach, not to mention the education, right? And the research that's out there and the data that's out there that professional therapists and mental health workers have access to. You just wish that more people, and I know we're getting there, but you do wish that more people saw that as, and I'm sure hopefully people do, like another support system, right? So that when parents are to that point that, oh my gosh, like I know my child and this isn't going anywhere. This isn't doing the thing. Like as much as we love to tap into maybe the network we have with family, friends, whatever, unless those family and friends are therapists or like young
Yeah.
in education or something that have an understanding of children, the opportunity to work with a therapist, to collaborate with somebody else so that you have somebody in your corner helping navigate that stuff, having that extra support. Like it can be so helpful that you just hope more and more parents approach that with their children.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I'm going to switch gears for a second because I
Yeah.
want to hear a little bit more about some of the tools in your toolbox that you
Mhm.
have. So I know that you specialize in CBT and exposure-based work.
Mhm.
Can you explain to our listeners what cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure and response prevention are, and what are those techniques used for?
Yes, and so they are separate. So cognitive behavioral therapy is really about identifying and changing negative thought patterns, emotions, and behaviors. It really focuses on using tools like cognitive restructuring and goal oriented exposure work for things like phobias. And essentially, is this idea that you can kind of identify these. They have a million different names. So, like automatic negative thought patterns. Sometimes kids call them like thinking traps, things like that, where essentially you find yourself like automatically engaging in like anxiety based or depression based thoughts, recognizing that that is the case, and essentially like trying to flip it or restructure it, so that you can not get stuck in those types of worry thoughts. It's also about identifying physical feelings in your bodies too. It's really about how thoughts, feelings, behaviors are all connected and being able to identify that aspect. And that's where I said earlier, like sometimes kids like don't even recognize what they're feeling. They know they're angry, but it's like, why am I that way?
Yeah.
Is it because I can't stop thinking about this thing that is worrying to me? And then something like exposure and response prevention is used with OCD. So the difference here, and this is the work that I engage in, there are like different ways to approach OCD, but ERP or response prevention is one of the best researched ways to treat OCD. It's not the same as cognitive restructuring because it's recognizing that intrusive thoughts and obsessive thoughts are like an entirely different beast than just typical anxiety or depression based thoughts. All that to say is like it's about preventing yourself from engaging in compulsions when you are exposed to triggers that then result in the obsessions that you might be having. And it's also just being able to recognize like, oh, that's an intrusive thought, like that's an OCD thought. I don't need to engage in that. And I can work to prevent myself from engaging in a compulsion. But it also all comes down to the same thing of being aware of what is happening in your head and in your body, right? Like you can't push through anxiety based feelings or push back against these obsessions or urges to engage in rituals or compulsions if you're not even aware of like what's happening inside yourself. And so a lot of it like starts from that place of what's called like psychoeducation, even like learning about what is going on. And again, learning to identify those feelings in your body, recognizing how you can kind of sit with those anxiety based feelings or distressful feelings that you might have if you have OCD, before you even get to the point of doing something like exposure therapy, or ERP.
So I think OCD is often misunderstood by a
Mhm.
lot of people. So what do you think most people get wrong about it?
I think there's multiple misconceptions. I think it's, one, this thought that like, oh, OCD is the same as anxiety, which it is not. OCD has the multiple tenets, right? Like it's this idea that you experience what's called obsessions or intrusive thoughts or images, and then compulsions, which are urges that you quite literally have to do or feel like you have to do in order to make these really uncomfortable or feelings of distress go away. There's also this idea that if you I think there's also this misconception about like what OCD even is. Of course, we all know, and like I think pop culture, where people see it as like, oh, you just have to wash your hands an X number of times or flick a light switch, which to be clear is absolutely compulsions that people do engage in. But there's various subtypes of OCD and various compulsions that people can engage in that I think sometimes makes it harder for people to recognize that that is what's going on in their child because of this misunderstanding of what OCD is and how it can present in different ways in people. There are a variety of different types of compulsions that someone might engage in. And essentially, too, like there's this idea if you kind of ignore OCD or like just ignore those thoughts, right? Like ignore those intrusive thoughts that literally can't get out of your head. They'll go away. And that's not the case. Um it's more so about acknowledging like those are OCD thoughts and then moving past that, which some people might call ignoring, but that's not what I call it.
But
Well,
it's a go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like that could be really like a slippery slope for
Mhm.
caregivers, right? So how do you respond without feeding the cycle of anxiety and compulsions? Like, how do you
Oh,
help them?
And so a lot of times this comes down to this idea of accommodating children, right? And typically, if somebody's engaging in ERP, um, there is an understanding that parents are likely having to do a lot of accommodations, especially if their child's to a point where they need treatment, right? Like they're having to do a lot in their life to try to avoid triggers, avoid their child getting stuck in engaging in compulsions. And so the goal of it is to slowly ease back those accommodations to get to a point where a caregiver can say something like, oh, that's OCD talking. I don't talk to OCD. We're moving past this. And even just being able to point out and address that, like, I'm not going to reinforce the urge to engage in this compulsion. But it's, again, important to highlight like every person that comes in is accommodating their child at the beginning because their child is likely in a place where they're so non-functional, like that's the only way that they can live their life. And so the goal through treatment is to pull back those accommodations and learn those skills to be able to, again, safely push your child and reinforce this idea like, nope, you can resist the urge to engage in this compulsion. Like you are capable of doing this.
Well, it's like the in the same way that awareness around mental health has
Mhm,
increased and therefore it leads it's like awareness and a normalization of, oh yeah, these are thoughts, right? These are
mhm,
feelings in the body that are happening because of these thoughts, or I'm paying attention, or
mhm,
normalizing conversation around it. Like even giving kind of OCD a character in and of itself. That's no,
mhm.
these are OCD thoughts. I don't have to engage with it, whatnot. That normalizing in a way that it becomes familiar,
Yep.
because familiarity takes some of the um and to be like, I'm just speaking, I think, for my own
Mhm,
anxiety history, whatnot. But like when it's familiar, it ends up being a little bit less scary too, right? And then when you can have conversations, whether it's with parents or with therapists, then it's like, oh, I'm not doing all of this on my own. And not that children even have that thought process yet,
mhm.
but I would think as they get older and that starts to, creep in, that's such a big part of the support piece, right? Like knowing that it's okay to talk about the things. It's okay to even name the things, that there are names for the things you're feeling, and that you're also not alone in having to deal with this from the parent perspective and or the child perspective.
Yeah, and I think normalizing is kind of a kind of a good way to say it in the sense that it's like, particularly with OCD related thoughts, they can be very distressing, very disturbing to individuals, and it can lead people to feel like there's something wrong with them because of these types of thoughts. And the reality is, everyone experiences intrusive thoughts. People who don't have OCD are able to kind of recognize, like, oh, that's just a thought. Like I had, I'm moving past it. And that is essentially where the trouble comes is like, you don't want to assign this label of like good or bad or true or false. It's this idea is like that is just a thought. The end. That is,
Mhm.
and that doesn't say anything about me. It doesn't say anything about the situation. And that can be, one of the hardest parts of it is recognizing like that is just a thought. It does not mean anything about me. It's not good or bad. It's not true or false. And I can just, and no, it can pass by and I don't have to engage in a compulsion in order to, or listen to what it's trying to tell me to do.
Well, and two, because like as I mean, this is a time when kids are figuring out their identity, right?
Mm,
And like starting to understand who they are and being able to, and I'm sure it's things that adults struggle with, right? But like
mhm.
understanding that the thing I'm experiencing is not my identity, that
Yeah.
there are different pieces. Like it's a label that maybe I can use to help understand myself or to understand the thing that is going on, but it isn't a part of like my identity
Uh,
necessarily. And because it's tricky. Sometimes identity can help us, you know, feel more comfortable in a thing if we're
mhm.
labeling certain things about ourselves and knowing that it's like, oh, I have an understanding then of myself. But also when it becomes a
Mhm.
um like scapegoat's not the right word. That's not, like a crutch or a hindrance to the rest of our identity or what we're trying to do. Like I would think there's some,
Yeah.
you know.
And I think that's a great broader conversation that I have all the time with coworkers. So I also do like neuropsych testing. So I diagnose, things like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, OCD, anxiety, depression, learning disabilities, things like that. And so I'm giving significant labels sometimes to individuals who I am diagnosing. And there's a weight with that. And I think there's a broader conversation to be had too about this idea of identifying so strongly with a diagnostic label that has been provided to you, because there's this balance, right? It's like, and I have this conversation with parents a lot too. That's like, okay, but what would be the benefit of me testing my child for X, Y, and Z? Like, what would the result of that be? And the first thing I always say is access to services, because
Mhm,
oftentimes you can't access accommodations or services in schools, in the community, unless you have specific diagnostic labels.
mhm,
And two, particularly with diagnoses, I think with ADHD and ASD, those labels can provide information to individuals about the things that they have maybe been struggling with for a really long time, that helps them better understand themselves and how they interact with the world. Because
mhm,
things like ADHD and ASD fall under this category of neurodevelopmental disorders. I kind of mentioned it earlier, right? They're not necessarily things like anxiety or depression, which absolutely, many factors feed into that, including biological factors. But
mhm,
this idea with ADHD and ASD is like it's present since birth, or perhaps before birth, and is not something that is like cured or goes away, right? Like you learn how to manage the symptoms and manage the challenges that come along with it. And so those in particular can be identifiers for people. But then of course you run the risk of a lot of different labels of like kind of over identifying with it. And I think I see this in particular with like younger generation of this idea of, oh, this is everything about me. And that even comes down to like the labels of like anxiety or depression, where
mhm.
it's like, oh, I have this, like this says everything about me and who I am. And that's not the case. But I think it comes down to broader conversations of like where people see the benefit of it or not, but also recognizing like the benefits and the things that those labels can get you,
Yeah.
which first and foremost is access to services.
That's a great differentiator and an important point, right? In
Mhm.
the systems that we work within,
Yep.
how there's a real benefit for certain things to have that label of it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm. So, I have some questions
Mhm.
just from kind of wrapping up that section about OCD and what d- do you see a lot of parents that come in blaming themselves for some of these things that their children are experiencing?
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Particularly, I would say with phobias or OCD, I see parents who come in because oftentimes it feels like there was a specific event that happened that triggered this to occur. When in reality, we know there's so many factors that feed into developing something like anxiety or depression or OCD. And particularly with OCD, oftentimes you have parents come in and be like, this one thing happened and now they have OCD. And it's like, no, there were likely like signs before that you just didn't pick up on. And yes, maybe this particular event was a huge trigger that resulted in, the significant impairment of functioning. But the reality is there's so many factors that feed into it. Like we talked, there's, environmental, biological, behavioral that can kind of result in these challenges. But absolutely parents will come in and be like, why did this even happen? And um, I think this is a great conversation to have too, because oftentimes for us, the why doesn't really matter because we're trying to manage and treat these symptoms. And so for us, it's like, yeah, maybe this specific thing contributed to it, but ultimately we're at the same endpoint of whether you kind of did that or not, or an entirely different event triggered this. And so it's like, now what can we do in order to help manage these symptoms and get kids back into a functional place? But I would say initially it's very common to see that, particularly with phobias and OCD.
Is there anything that parents worry about that matters less than they think it does?
Great question.
Absolutely. And it comes down to how big of an impact they feel like they might have on their child. Like, I feel like oftentimes they feel like one singular thing will mess up their kid.
Mm.
And they have to protect their kid from everything. When in reality, again, there's so many different factors that go into humans growing and developing. And I think the biggest thing is keeping your child safe, right? Physically, emotionally safe. And from there, one specific thing is not going to like necessarily have this domino effect on your child and ruin their life. And so I think it's often this pressure to like get everything right when in reality, like you might mess up, you might scream at your kid, you might, accidentally put them in an anxiety provoking situation, or you might do this, but in reality, you can often recover from that as long as you put in the effort. And one particular thing is not going to be this domino effect that you think it is.
Hmm. If you could give one sentence to every anxious child out there, what would you tell them?
I stole this from my coworker. I'll give her credit. I loved this. Anxiety is adaptive until it makes your world small. Essentially,
Oh,
everyone feels anxiety and worry, and it's an emotion everyone is supposed to feel in certain situations as it's designed to make you feel safe. That's how it's adaptive. But if it's making your world small, it's stopping you from doing the things that you want to do or the things that you love, it's no longer adaptive. And so it's this idea of it's okay to feel anxiety and maybe recognize right now it's making your world way too small and we want to help you be able to do everything that you want to do in the world.
well, I don't know about you, Becca, but I kind of feel like I just had a therapy session.
Literally, I'm
I'm
over here like that line literally just made me emotional and started bringing tears to my eyes because I genuinely am like, I wish I would have heard that personally 20
yeah.
years ago when I
Mhm.
was struggling big time with anxiety, where it was making my world very small. And it was like,
Mhm.
oh, yeah. And at that point, I don't think I mean, we weren't having the conversations
Yeah.
around it like we are today, but I was like, that literally just, I reacted with some tears in my
Yeah.
eyes from that line. Cause I'm like, yeah, for a kid or a teen or anybody even adults navigating through it now, that line, yeah, I mean, shares a lot. So
So
very
good.
helpful.
Yeah, so good. I mean, I'm just like, wow, that makes so much sense. And all this stuff that you worry about, whether you're a child or a parent or just a human in general, because you're right, we all have anxiety, we all worry, we all have fear. Um, and sometimes you get trapped in those cycles of just
Mhm.
one thought on repeat, right? That you just can't stop thinking about. And it does make your world small. So I think that's amazing advice. Okay, one last question. Unless you have anything else, Becca. I don't know if
No,
you
go for it.
you had anything. Okay. So if a caregiver who's listening right now feels overwhelmed or scared for their child, what would you tell them? What would you want them to know?
I think one, if you feel overwhelmed and scared for your child, you know them best. You know something is not right. Like, you know that they're not functioning in the ideal way. Two, there are people who went to school for a very long time who are there to help you. You do not have to handle everything on your own, right? Like it's the, age old longer of like, it takes a village. That includes all the professionals out there who can assist you in helping you, your child and your family. And it's like, reach out to them. Because again, they went to school for a really long time in order to do that. And they can also be there to just like walk with you and support you and provide the tools that maybe you don't have. And it's okay that you don't have. So don't be afraid to reach out for that.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this has been a great conversation. I think it's probably going to help a lot of people who are navigating just life in general, right? I mean, life is tough. And like I said, whether you're just a human walking on the earth, or you're a parent, or you're a kid, or an adolescent, I think you gave us some really, really good advice and just things to think about, Julia. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so
It's
much
been
for having
awesome.
me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you asked some great questions that made me think.
Well,
That's
good.
our goal.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. So thanks to everybody who's listening. If anything that you heard today resonates with, for you, or you want to share it with a friend, we'd love for you to do that. We'd love for you to like and subscribe to our show, and we will catch you on the flip side. Have a great week.